The anniversary dinner was supposed to be a celebration. 43 years of marriage to my beloved Harold, may he rest in peace, and here I was, 6 months after his funeral, sitting at the head of what used to be our dining room table. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was relegated to the smallest chair while my daughter-in-law Melissa sprawled across Harold's old seat like she owned the place. "Margaret, could you pass the salt?" Melissa's voice dripped with false sweetness, the kind that made my skin crawl. She'd been calling me by my first name since the day she married my son David 3 years ago, despite my repeated requests for Mom or at least Mrs. Thompson. I reached for the salt shaker, my arthritis making the simple movement more laborious than it should have been. The cancer treatments had weakened me more than I let on, but I'd learned to hide the trembling in my hands, the fatigue that hit me like waves throughout the day. Nobody in this family seemed to notice anyway. "You know, Margaret," Melissa continued, cutting into her prime rib with theatrical precision, "David and I have been talking about your living situation." My son looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. At 35, David had inherited his father's gentle eyes but somewhere along the way had lost Harold's backbone. "Mom, we're just concerned about you rattling around in this big house all alone." The house. Our house. The Victorian mansion Harold and I had restored together, room by room, over 4 decades. Every creaking floorboard held a memory, every carefully chosen piece of furniture told our story. But to them, it was just square footage and property value. "I'm managing just fine," I said quietly, taking a sip of water instead of the wine they'd opened. The medication made alcohol impossible, though I'd never mentioned that detail. Melissa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Fine? Margaret, you can barely afford the utilities. We've seen the bills." Had they? I kept my expression neutral, though inside I was calculating. The utility bills they'd seen were for the small apartment I'd been renting downtown for the past 8 months. This house? The bills for this house went to a very different address, paid by a very different account. "The property taxes alone are eating you alive," David added, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "And the maintenance costs." I nodded along, letting them paint their picture of my financial distress. If only they knew that the woman they saw as a burden owned the construction company that had done their kitchen renovation last year. If only they realized that their struggling mother-in-law held the controlling interest in the tech startup that had made David's modest salary possible. "We've been looking at some lovely assisted living facilities," Melissa continued, pulling out her phone with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation. "Golden Years Manor has excellent reviews, and the monthly fee is very reasonable." Reasonable? I'd looked up Golden Years Manor myself after overhearing their conversations through the baby monitor they didn't know I'd found in my bedroom. $3,800 a month for a studio apartment with shared bathrooms and cafeteria food. Meanwhile, my monthly income from just one of my investment portfolios exceeded $50,000. "The best part," Melissa said, her eyes lighting up with greed she thought she was hiding, "is that once you're settled there, David and I can take over the house payments and property management. You know, to help you out financially." Help me out. I almost smiled at that. The mortgage on this house had been paid off for 15 years. What they were really proposing was theft, pure and simple, dressed up as family concern. "That's very thoughtful of you both," I managed, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "But I'm not quite ready for that step yet." Melissa's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator underneath. "Margaret, you're 72 years old with medical bills piling up. This isn't about what you want anymore. It's about what's practical." Medical bills. If only she knew that my medical bills were being paid by the Pharmaceutical Research Foundation I'd quietly funded for the past decade. The same foundation that was working on groundbreaking treatments for the exact type of cancer I was fighting. The irony was delicious, even if I was the only one who could appreciate it. David cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his wife's directness. "What Melissa means is that we want to take care of you, Mom. You've been through so much since Dad died." Since Dad died. Those 4 words carried so much weight, so much pain that these two would never understand. Harold had been my partner in everything, including the business empire we'd built together in secret. For 40 years, we'd presented ourselves as a comfortable middle-class couple while quietly amassing wealth that would have shocked our friends and family. The cleaning company I'd started in my 30s? It now employed over 300 people across 6 states. The little side business Harold had mentioned occasionally? A software development firm that held patents worth millions. The rental properties we'd claimed were breaking even? They'd been generating 6-figure profits annually for over a decade. But Harold and I had agreed early on to keep our success private. We'd seen too many families torn apart by money, too many children who became entitled and lazy when they knew wealth was waiting for them. We'd wanted David to make his own way, to develop his own character and work ethic. Looking at him now, listening to his wife plot to steal my home while I sat right there, I wondered if we'd made a mistake. Had we been too subtle? Had our attempts to teach him humility and hard work backfired so completely that he'd married a woman who saw his poor mother as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome? I appreciate your concern, I said finally, setting down my water glass with deliberate care. But I think I'd like to stay put a little while longer. Melissa's jaw tightened. Margaret, you're being unrealistic. The insurance company called last week asking about overdue payments. That was interesting. I made a mental note to check with my actual insurance company, the premium plan I'd paid for a full year in advance. Someone had been making phone calls, fishing for information about my finances. Someone who clearly thought they were much cleverer than they actually were. Perhaps there's been some confusion, I said mildly. I'll look into it. There's no confusion, Melissa snapped, her patience finally wearing thin. You're drowning, Margaret, and you're too proud to admit it. David, tell her. My son looked between his wife and me, clearly torn. Part of me hoped he'd stand up to her, defend his mother, show some trace of the boy I'd raised to be kind and loyal. Instead, he reached across the table and patted my hand with condescending gentleness. Mom, maybe you should at least tour Golden Years Manor. Just to see what it's like. No pressure. No pressure. From the woman who'd already picked out paint colors for her new home office in what used to be Harold's study. I'd found the Pinterest board last month when she'd carelessly left her laptop open in my kitchen. Well, I said, standing slowly and letting my age show in the movement, this has certainly given me a lot to think about. Melissa's smile was triumphant. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. I've already scheduled a tour for Thursday morning. 10 o'clock sharp. She'd scheduled a tour. Without asking me. Without even confirming that I was interested. The casual disrespect was staggering, but I kept my expression neutral, even grateful. That was very efficient of you. I like to plan ahead, Melissa said, already clearing the dishes with the air of someone who considered the matter settled. David, help your mother to her room. She looks tired. Tired. Yes, I was tired. Tired of playing this role, tired of pretending to be helpless, tired of watching my son enable his wife's cruelty. But mostly, I was tired of being underestimated. As David walked me to the stairs, his hand hovering near my elbow like I might topple over at any moment, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. A text from my financial advisor, confirming that the property acquisition I'd requested had gone through. By tomorrow morning, I'd officially own the strip mall where Melissa worked as a boutique manager. Good night, Mom, David said, kissing my forehead with the same mechanical affection he'd shown since childhood. Sweet dreams. Good night, sweetheart, I replied, meaning it despite everything. He was still my son, still the little boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly. Somewhere under all that weakness and manipulation, that boy still existed. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear Melissa already on the phone, her voice carrying clearly through the old house's thin walls. Yes, Golden Years Manor? This is about Margaret Thompson's tour on Thursday. I just wanted to confirm that you have the financial assessment forms ready. Financial assessment forms. How thorough of her. How completely, devastatingly thorough. I closed my bedroom door and walked to the window overlooking the garden Harold and I had planted together. Tomorrow, I'd start making some calls of my own. Tonight, I'd let them believe they were winning. But as I reached for my bedside table to take my evening medication, my fingers brushed against the small velvet box I'd hidden there months ago. Harold's wedding ring, the one I'd been wearing on a chain around my neck since his funeral. The one I'd planned to give to David someday, when he'd earned the right to wear his father's symbol of love and commitment. Looking down at the garden where Harold's roses were just beginning to bloom, I made a decision that would change everything. Some gifts had to be earned. And some people needed to learn the hard way that love and loyalty couldn't be stolen, no matter how clever they thought they were. The tour at Golden Years Manor was going to be very enlightening indeed. Part 2, The Ring and the Revelation. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made everything look deceivingly cheerful. I dressed carefully in my most worn cardigan and the shoes with the slight scuff marks, playing my part perfectly as Melissa's car pulled into the driveway at exactly 9:45 a.m. She'd brought David, of course, for moral support and to present a united front. They both wore the expressions of people embarking on an unpleasant but necessary duty, like taking a pet to be euthanized. "Good morning, Margaret," Melissa chirped, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "Ready for our little adventure?" Adventure. As if warehousing elderly people was some kind of exciting expedition. I nodded meekly and allowed David to help me into the back seat, noting how neither of them offered to let me sit in front. The drive to Golden Years Manor took 23 minutes through the parts of town where property values had been steadily declining for years. I watched familiar landmarks pass by, including the corner where Harold and I had opened our first cleaning service office in 1987. The building now housed a payday loan business, and I wondered if Melissa realized that the struggling woman in her backseat still owned the entire block. "I think you're really going to love this place, Mom," David said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "They have activities, social opportunities, medical care right on site." Medical care. The kind provided by overworked nurses and understaffed facilities. Nothing like the private concierge medical service I'd been using since Harold's diagnosis 5 years ago. The same service that was currently monitoring my cancer treatment with the precision of a NASA mission. Golden Years Manor rose from a sea of cracked asphalt like a monument to institutional indifference. The building was barely 10 years old but already showed signs of corner-cutting construction, from the peeling paint around the windows to the patched foundation settling that spoke of poor soil preparation. Inside, the lobby tried desperately to look cheerful with aggressive floral wallpaper and furniture that seemed designed more for easy cleaning than comfort. The smell hit me immediately, that particular combination of industrial disinfectant, overcooked food, and human resignation that marked every cut-rate care facility I'd ever visited. "Mrs. Thompson." A woman in her 40s approached us with the kind of aggressive friendliness that immediately put me on guard. "I'm Sandra Fleming, the admissions coordinator. We're so excited to show you around." Excited? Yes, I could see the dollar signs practically glowing in her eyes as she sized me up. An elderly widow with family support and what appeared to be modest but steady income? I was exactly the kind of resident that kept places like this profitable. "This is my daughter-in-law, Melissa," I said quietly, "and my son David. They've been so helpful with all the arrangements." "Wonderful. Family support is so important during these transitions," Sandra gushed, leading us down a hallway lined with motivational posters that felt more like threats. "Let me show you one of our premium studio units." Premium studio unit. The room was barely larger than Harold's old walk-in closet, with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair positioned next to a window that looked out onto the dumpsters behind the building. The bathroom was so small I would have had to back out of it to close the door. "Isn't this cozy?" Melissa said, running her hand along the laminate countertop that was already showing wear marks. "And look, Margaret, you'd have your own little kitchenette." Little kitchenette. A mini-fridge, a microwave, and 2 electric burners that looked like they'd been salvaged from a college dormitory. I thought of my kitchen at home, with its professional-grade appliances and granite countertops that Harold and I had selected together during our renovation 3 years ago. "The monthly fee includes 3 meals a day in our dining facility," Sandra continued, "plus housekeeping services twice a week, and access to all our activity programs." "What kind of activities?" David asked, genuinely trying to sound interested. "Oh, we have bingo every Tuesday, craft time on Thursday afternoons, and movie night on Saturdays. Very popular with our residents." Bingo and craft time. I thought of the board meetings I attended monthly for the various companies I owned, the strategic planning sessions, the complex financial decisions that affected hundreds of employees. They wanted to trade that for bingo and arts and crafts. "And the medical care?" Melissa asked, though I could tell she was just going through the motions. She'd already decided this place was perfect. "We have a registered nurse on duty during business hours," Sandra said proudly, and we're partnered with several local physicians who make regular rounds. Business hours. So if I had a medical emergency at night or on weekends, I'd be on my own until Monday morning. The contrast with my current medical team, available 24/7, equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment, and led by some of the most respected oncologists in the country, was almost laughable. Now, let's talk about the financial arrangements, Sandra said, pulling out a folder thick with forms. The monthly fee is $3,800, plus additional charges for any special care needs or medical services not covered by insurance. That seems very reasonable, Melissa said quickly, before I could respond. Don't you think so, Margaret? Reasonable. For a room the size of a prison cell with food that smelled like it had been prepared sometime last week. I nodded slowly, playing my part as the overwhelmed elderly woman who was grateful for any solution to her problems. There is a small entrance fee, Sandra continued, just to secure your spot on our waiting list. $25,000, fully refundable if you change your mind within 30 days. $25,000. I did some quick mental math. At the current interest rates on my investment accounts, I earned more than that every month just from dividends alone. That's quite a bit of money, I said hesitantly, watching Melissa's face carefully. Don't worry about that, Margaret, she said, her eyes bright with anticipation. We can help you access your home equity to cover the costs. It's really the smartest financial move. Access my home equity. Translation: sign over my house to cover care facility fees while they moved in and took over everything Harold and I had built together. I suppose I could consider a reverse mortgage, I said slowly, as if the idea had just occurred to me. Exactly. David jumped in, clearly relieved that I was being so cooperative. It would solve all your financial worries, Mom. All my financial worries. If only they knew that my biggest financial worry was deciding which charity should receive the largest donation from my estate when I was gone. We finished the tour with Sandra practically salivating over the paperwork. She had all the forms ready for the entrance fee, the financial assessment, and even a preliminary moving timeline. Melissa had clearly done her homework, preparing Sandra for an elderly woman who was ready to be swept along by her more competent family members. I think this could work very well, I said as we stood in the lobby, surrounded by seniors who looked like they'd given up on life years ago. But I'll need some time to think it over. Of course. Sandra beamed. Take all the time you need. We'll hold the studio unit for you until the end of the week. The end of the week. How generous of them to give me 4 whole days to decide to throw away my independence and dignity. The drive home was filled with Melissa's enthusiastic chatter about how perfect the facility was, how much money I'd save, how much easier life would be without the burden of maintaining a house. David chimed in occasionally with supporting comments, playing his role as the dutiful son who just wanted what was best for his mother. We could have you moved in by the end of the month, Melissa said as we pulled into the driveway. I've already researched some estate sale companies that could handle selling your furniture and personal items. Estate sale companies. She'd researched estate sale companies. While I was still alive and sitting right there in the car with her. That's very thorough of you, I managed, my voice barely steady. I believe in being prepared, she said with satisfaction. David, help your mother inside. I want to take some measurements for the office renovation. Office renovation. In the house that she thought would be hers within a month. The audacity was breathtaking, but I followed David to the front door without protest, my mind already working through the phone calls I'd need to make. We'd barely stepped into the foyer when Melissa pushed past us, heading straight for the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who already considered herself the homeowner. I watched her rifle through the drawers, looking for a measuring tape, acting like Harold and I had never existed at all. You know, Mom, David said, helping me out of my coat, I think this is really going to be good for you. No more worrying about bills or maintenance or being alone. He kept talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. My attention was fixed on Melissa, who had found Harold's toolbox and was now pulling out his tape measure, his hammer, his level, tools he'd used to build this house into our home, now being handled by someone who saw them as nothing more than convenient equipment for her remodeling plans. That's when she spotted it. Harold's wedding ring, which I'd been wearing on a chain around my neck since his funeral, had somehow slipped outside my shirt during the tour. The gold caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window, and Melissa's eyes locked onto it with laser focus. Margaret, she said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, what is that around your neck? I looked down, realizing my mistake. The ring was clearly visible, hanging from its delicate chain, still warm from resting against my heart for the past 6 months. It's Harold's wedding ring, I said simply. I've been wearing it since. You've been wearing it. Melissa's voice rose sharply. Margaret, that ring belongs to David now. It should have been passed down to him months ago. David looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. Mom, I didn't know you were still wearing Dad's ring. Of course she's still wearing it, Melissa snapped. She's been hoarding it like everything else in this house. David, tell her. Tell her what? That a grieving widow had no right to keep her husband's wedding ring close to her heart? That a symbol of 43 years of love and partnership should be handed over to someone who'd never even met Harold? It's just. David started, then stopped, clearly torn between his wife and his mother. It's just nothing, Melissa said, taking a step closer to me. That ring represents the Thompson family legacy. It should go to the next generation, not stay buried with the past. Family legacy. She'd been married to David for 3 years and suddenly she was an expert on Thompson family traditions. The ring Harold had saved for 6 months to buy when we got engaged, the ring that had never left his finger until the day he died, was now apparently part of her inheritance plan. I'm not ready to give it up yet, I said quietly, my hand instinctively rising to touch the ring through my shirt. Ready? Melissa's laugh was sharp and ugly. Margaret, you don't get to decide what you're ready for anymore. That ring belongs to David, period. It belongs to my father, David said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I mean, it belonged to him. Now it should. I guess it should be mine. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The boy who used to crawl into bed with Harold and me during thunderstorms, who cried when his pet hamster died, who once told me I was the most beautiful woman in the world. That boy was gone. In his place stood a weak man who let his wife make decisions about his own father's memory. Take it off, Melissa said, moving even closer. Right now. Melissa, please, David started, but she held up a hand to silence him. No, David. I'm tired of tiptoeing around her feelings. She's moving to Golden Years Manor in 3 weeks, and that ring is staying with the family. Take it off, Margaret. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock Harold and I had bought at an antique store during our honeymoon. 43 years ago, when we'd thought we had forever to love each other, to build a life together, to watch our son grow into a man we could be proud of. I reached up slowly and lifted the chain over my head. Harold's ring swung gently in the afternoon light, catching the sun and throwing tiny rainbows across the kitchen walls. For a moment, I could almost see him standing next to the stove, making his famous Sunday morning pancakes and humming off-key. There, I said, holding the chain out toward David. If that's what you want. But Melissa snatched it before David could react, her fingers closing around the ring with the possessiveness of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for months. Finally, she said, examining the ring with obvious satisfaction. David, this will look perfect on you once we get it resized. Resized. Harold's ring, worn smooth by 43 years of love and commitment, was going to be resized to fit the finger of a man who couldn't even stand up to his wife when she insulted his dead father's memory. I think I need to lie down, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Good idea, Melissa said, already fastening the chain around her own neck like a trophy. All this excitement has been a lot for you to process. Excitement. She called watching her steal my husband's wedding ring excitement. I started toward the stairs, but Melissa's voice stopped me. Oh, and Margaret? I'll be measuring the master bedroom tomorrow for new furniture. You might want to start packing your personal items. I turned back to look at her, this woman who just claimed my husband's ring and was now planning to redecorate the bedroom where Harold and I had loved each other for 4 decades. She was actually smiling, clearly thrilled with how well her plans were proceeding. Of course, I said. I'll start packing right away. But instead of going upstairs, I walked to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen where I kept my personal phone. The one neither David nor Melissa knew about, the one connected to accounts they'd never heard of and people they'd never imagined I knew. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear Melissa already on the phone with someone, probably an interior designer, discussing paint colors and furniture arrangements for her new master suite. She was so excited about her victory, so focused on her plans for tomorrow, that she didn't notice me pause at the top of the stairs to make a phone call of my own. "Hello, Marcus? It's Margaret Thompson. Yes, I know it's been a while. I need you to accelerate the timeline on that property acquisition we discussed. Tomorrow morning would be perfect." Marcus Chen had been Harold's and my attorney for over 20 years. He'd handled the creation of our shell companies, our property purchases, our carefully constructed financial privacy that had allowed us to build wealth while appearing to live modestly. He'd also drafted Harold's will, the real one, not the simple document David and Melissa thought represented the entirety of his estate. "And Marcus," I added, listening to Melissa's voice drift up from the kitchen as she planned the destruction of my life. "It's time to implement the full estate revelation protocol." "Yes, all of it." I ended the call and walked to my bedroom window, looking down at the garden where Harold's roses were in full bloom. Tomorrow, Melissa would start measuring bedrooms and planning renovations. Tomorrow, David would probably take his father's ring to be resized. But tonight, I had some measurements of my own to take. Starting with exactly how much Justice's 43 years of marriage and a stolen wedding ring was worth. Part 3. The Toilet, the Truth, and the Reckoning. The next morning brought the kind of autumn chill that made me grateful for the heated floors Harold and I had installed throughout the house 3 years ago. Melissa arrived early, armed with measuring tape, paint samples, and a notebook full of renovation ideas she'd clearly been planning for months. She'd also brought David, though he looked less enthusiastic about today's mission than his wife. I suspected the reality of dismantling his childhood home was hitting him harder than he'd expected. "Good morning, Margaret," Melissa called out as she let herself in through the front door. "I hope you got some rest. Today's going to be a big day." A big day. Yes, it certainly was going to be that. I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and reading the morning paper like I had every day for the past 40 years. The routine was comforting, even if everything else in my life was about to change dramatically. "Morning, Mom," David said, kissing my forehead with the same distracted affection he'd shown since Melissa entered our lives. "How are you feeling about everything?" "Resigned," I said truthfully. It wasn't a lie. I was resigned to the fact that my son had married a woman who saw his family as nothing more than assets to be acquired. Melissa was already heading upstairs, her footsteps echoing through the house with proprietary confidence. I could hear her moving around in the master bedroom, opening closets and drawers, probably calculating how much of Harold's and my personal belongings she'd need to dispose of. "David," I said quietly, "could you help me with something in the downstairs bathroom? There's a problem with the toilet that I can't quite manage on my own." "Of course, Mom." He followed me down the hallway to the small powder room near the front entrance, the one Harold had renovated just 2 years before his diagnosis. The problem with the toilet was entirely fictional, but I needed David away from his wife for what was about to happen. As we entered the small bathroom, I could see Harold's ring glinting on the chain around David's neck. Melissa had apparently convinced him to wear it immediately, before even getting it resized. "What seems to be the issue?" David asked, lifting the toilet seat and peering into the bowl. "Actually," I said, closing the bathroom door behind us, "the problem isn't with the toilet. It's with this." I pulled out my phone and showed him a photograph, Harold's real wedding ring, the one he'd been buried with, glinting on his finger in one of our last pictures together. David stared at the photo, then looked down at the ring hanging around his neck, his face slowly draining of color. "Mom, I don't understand. The ring Melissa took from me yesterday," I said calmly, "belonged to your father's brother Michael. Harold was wearing it temporarily while his own ring was being repaired after he'd lost weight during his illness." The silence in the small bathroom was deafening. I could hear Melissa upstairs, still measuring and planning, completely unaware that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. But she said it was Dad's ring. She said it belonged to the family." "It does belong to the family," I agreed. "To Michael's family. His widow has been looking for it since the funeral. She was heartbroken that it had gone missing." David's hand went to the chain around his neck, his fingers closing around the ring that wasn't his inheritance, wasn't his father's legacy. Wasn't anything more than a piece of jewelry that Melissa had claimed through pure greed and ignorance. "She didn't know," he said weakly. "She just assumed." "She assumed a lot of things," I said. Including that I was too senile and grief-stricken to remember which ring was which. That's when we heard Melissa's voice from upstairs, sharp and demanding. David, come up here and help me move this dresser. And bring your mother, I want her to see something. David looked at me helplessly, clearly torn between loyalty to his wife and the growing realization that he'd been manipulated into stealing from his own family. What do I do? You do what your father would have wanted, I said gently. You do what's right. We climbed the stairs together, David's footsteps heavy with dread. In the master bedroom, Melissa had already moved half the furniture and was standing in front of Harold's dresser with her hands on her hips, looking frustrated. Finally, she said without turning around. David, help me move this monstrosity. It's completely wrong for the space I have planned. Harold's dresser. The antique piece we'd found at an estate sale during our first year of marriage, when we could barely afford the $25 the seller was asking. Harold had spent 3 weekends refinishing it, sanding away decades of neglect and bringing out the beautiful oak grain underneath. Actually, David said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in months, I don't think we should be moving Dad's furniture just yet. Melissa turned around, clearly annoyed by his resistance. David, we discussed this. Your mother is moving to Golden Years Manor in 3 weeks. This furniture won't fit in a studio apartment. About that, I said, stepping into the room. I've been thinking about the moving timeline. There's nothing to think about, Melissa said firmly. Everything's already arranged. The entrance fee, the financial assessment, the furniture disposal, it's all handled. Except for one small detail, I said, walking to the window that looked out over the garden Harold had loved so much. I never actually agreed to move. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Melissa stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language, clearly unable to process the idea that I might have opinions about my own life. Margaret, you signed the forms yesterday. No, I said calmly, I looked at the forms yesterday. I never signed anything. But the entrance fee is still in your imagination, I finished. Along with your new office and your furniture plans and your assumption that you have any say in what happens to this house. Melissa's face was cycling through several shades of red, her carefully constructed composure finally beginning to crack. You can't just change your mind. Everything's been arranged. Yes, I agreed, you've arranged quite a lot. Including stealing a ring that didn't belong to you. David's hand went to his neck again, the weight of Michael's ring suddenly feeling heavier than gold should. What are you talking about? Melissa demanded. That ring belonged to Harold. Actually, David said quietly, it belonged to Uncle Michael. For a moment, Melissa looked like she'd been slapped. Then her eyes narrowed dangerously. You're both being ridiculous. Even if that's true, which I doubt, it doesn't change anything. Margaret, you're still going to Golden Years Manor, and this house is still going to be ours. Ours. Even now, even caught in an outright lie about the ring, she still believed she had claim to Harold's and my life's work. That's when I heard the sound I'd been waiting for all morning. Car doors slamming in the driveway, followed by the confident footsteps of people who knew exactly where they were going and why they were there. Expecting someone? Melissa asked, moving to the window to look down at the driveway. As a matter of fact, yes. Marcus Chen's silver Mercedes was parked behind Melissa's car, along with a vehicle I didn't recognize but could guess the purpose of. Through the window, I could see Marcus walking toward the front door with his briefcase and the measured pace of a man who'd handled difficult situations before. Who is that? David asked, though something in his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect that his poor, confused mother might not be as helpless as he'd believed. My attorney, I said simply. The word attorney hit Melissa like a physical blow. Your attorney? Margaret, what have you done? The doorbell rang once, sharp and businesslike. I started toward the stairs, but Melissa grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. You're not answering that door until you tell me what's going on. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face, and for the first time in 3 years, I let her see exactly who she was dealing with. Take your hand off me, I said, my voice carrying authority that made David step back involuntarily. Now. Something in my tone must have penetrated Melissa's panic, because she released my arm and took a step back. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I suggest you both come downstairs, I said, smoothing my cardigan and walking toward the staircase. This concerns you as much as it does me. Marcus was waiting in the foyer when I opened the door, his familiar smile warming his distinguished features. Behind him stood a woman I recognized from photographs but had never met in person, Detective Sarah Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit. Margaret, Marcus said, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. You look well, considering everything you've been dealing with. Hello, Marcus. Detective Martinez, thank you for coming so quickly. David and Melissa had followed me downstairs, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Melissa's face had gone pale, while David simply looked confused and increasingly worried. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Martinez said, pulling out a badge that made Melissa gasp audibly. I understand you've been having some financial irregularities that need to be investigated. Financial irregularities? David echoed. Mom, what's going on? Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Perhaps we should all sit down. This is going to take a while to explain. We moved to the living room, where Harold and I had hosted countless family gatherings over the years. Melissa perched on the edge of the couch like she was ready to bolt, while David sat heavily in his father's old armchair, still fingering the chain around his neck. Let's start with the simple facts, Marcus said, opening the folder and spreading documents across the coffee table. Margaret, would you like to tell them, or shall I? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and kind, who'd somehow become someone I barely recognized. David, do you remember when you were 10 and you asked your father and me why we didn't live in a bigger house like Tommy Morrison's family? Yes. You said you and Dad believed in living within your means. That was true, I said. We did believe in that. We also believed in privacy. What we didn't tell you was that we could have afforded 10 houses like Tommy Morrison's family. Marcus pulled out the first document, a financial statement that made David's eyes widen and Melissa make a small choking sound. Your mother, Marcus said calmly, is worth approximately $47 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. The same clock Harold and I had bought to celebrate our first million in revenue 30 years ago. That's impossible, Melissa whispered. She can't even afford her utility bills. Actually, Detective Martinez interjected, that's one of the things we need to discuss. Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us about the utility bills that were supposedly overdue? I smiled, remembering the conversation from dinner 2 nights ago. I pay my utilities through an automatic transfer from my primary checking account. They've never been late, not once in 40 years. Then who called claiming they were overdue? David asked, though the look on his face suggested he was beginning to understand. Detective Martinez pulled out her own folder. We've traced several calls made from this house to various service providers, insurance companies, and financial institutions. Someone was impersonating Mrs. Thompson and fishing for information about her accounts. All eyes turned to Melissa, who was now gripping the arm of the couch so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I was trying to help, she said defensively. Margaret was clearly confused about her finances. I was just trying to get a clear picture of her situation. By impersonating her? Detective Martinez asked. That's identity theft, Mrs. Thompson. A federal crime. Let's continue with the financial overview, Marcus said, pulling out more documents. Margaret, would you like to explain about the house? I gestured around the living room that Melissa had been planning to redecorate. This house has been paid off for 15 years. The property taxes are handled by my accountant, and the insurance is paid annually through one of my business accounts. But the mortgage payments? David started. What mortgage payments? I asked gently. David, your father and I bought this house with cash in 1982. More documents appeared on the coffee table, property deeds, business incorporation papers, investment portfolios that painted a picture of wealth so vast that David and Melissa could only stare in stunned silence. Thompson Property Management owns 17 commercial buildings in 3 states, Marcus continued. Clean Sweep Solutions employs over 300 people and generates approximately $8 million in revenue annually. And then there are the investment accounts. Stop, Melissa said suddenly, her voice cracking. Just stop. This is all fake. Margaret, you're sick, you're confused. These documents don't mean anything. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson, that brings us to another issue. We've had reports that you've been interfering with Mrs. Thompson's medical care. I haven't interfered with anything. You threw away her insulin prescription last week, David said quietly, his voice heavy with dawning horror. You said diabetics don't live long anyway. I was making a point about her being dramatic. About medication she needs to survive. Detective Martinez asked. That's criminal neglect, potentially attempted manslaughter. The room fell silent again as the weight of Detective Martinez's words sank in. I watched my son's face as he processed everything, the lies about my finances, the theft of information, the interference with my medical care, the casual cruelty disguised as tough love. There's more, Marcus said gently. Margaret, do you want to tell them about the business acquisition? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 40 years, raised my son, mourned my husband, and watched my family fall apart. 3 days ago, I purchased the strip mall where Melissa works. You what? Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. Thompson Property Management now owns Riverside Shopping Center. Your boutique, the coffee shop, the nail salon, all of it. But that's impossible. The owner is some big corporation. TPC Holdings, Marcus confirmed. A subsidiary of Thompson Property Management, which is wholly owned by Margaret Thompson. I turned back to face them, seeing my son and daughter-in-law with complete clarity for the first time in years. Melissa, you've been paying rent to me for 3 years. The struggling old woman you've been planning to warehouse in a cut-rate nursing home is actually your landlord. David was staring at the documents spread across the coffee table like they were written in a foreign language. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? Because your father and I wanted you to make your own way in the world. We wanted you to develop character, work ethic, the values that money can't buy. I paused, looking at the man he'd become. We were hoping you'd find a wife who loved you for who you are, not what she thought you might inherit someday. Melissa had gone very still, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've been lying to us for years. I've been private about my affairs, I corrected. There's a difference between privacy and lying. You, on the other hand, have been committing multiple felonies. Detective Martinez stood up, pulling out a pair of handcuffs that glinted in the afternoon light. Melissa Thompson, you're under arrest for identity theft, financial fraud, and elder abuse. Elder abuse? Melissa shrieked, jumping to her feet. I never touched her. Throwing away medication, interfering with medical care, financial exploitation, emotional abuse. Detective Martinez rattled off the charges as she moved toward Melissa. You have the right to remain silent. David. Melissa turned toward her husband desperately. David, tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them I was trying to help. But David was staring at his hands, where Uncle Michael's ring caught the light from the window. When he looked up, his eyes were full of tears. You threw away Mom's insulin, he said quietly. You laughed when you did it. I was making a point. You were trying to kill her, he said, his voice stronger now. Maybe not directly, but, God, Melissa, what were you thinking? As Detective Martinez finished reading Melissa her rights, Marcus pulled out one final document. David, there's something else you need to know. I don't think I can handle anything else. Your father's will. The real one. Marcus handed him a legal document thick enough to be a small book. What you saw after the funeral was just the preliminary distribution. This is the full estate. David's hands shook as he opened the will, his eyes scanning page after page of bequests, trusts, and provisions that Harold had spent years crafting with meticulous care. There's a trust fund, David read aloud, his voice barely audible. For my future grandchildren's education. And another one for. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. Mom, this is millions of dollars. Your father loved you very much, I said softly. He wanted to make sure you and your family would always be secure. But he also wanted to make sure you earned it. Earned it how? Marcus pointed to a specific clause in the will. By demonstrating the values Harold and Margaret raised you with. Kindness, loyalty, respect for family, protection of those who can't protect themselves. David read the clause, his face growing paler with each word. If I fail to honor and protect my mother, if I allow anyone to abuse or exploit her, the trust funds are forfeit. All of them, Marcus confirmed. Every penny your father left you was contingent on you being the man he raised you to be. In the silence that followed, we could hear Melissa being led out to the police car, her voice rising in increasingly desperate protests. Through the window, I watched neighbors gathering on their porches, drawn by the commotion and the flashing lights. I failed him, David said finally, his voice breaking. I failed Dad, and I failed you, and I let that woman nearly kill you for money that was never even mine to inherit. I sat down beside my son and took his hands in mine, feeling how much they shook, how cold they'd become. You made mistakes, David. Serious ones. But you're still my son, and you're still Harold's son. But the will has provisions for redemption, Marcus said gently. Your father wasn't a cruel man. He believed people could learn from their mistakes. What kind of provisions? I smiled, thinking of Harold's careful planning, his eternal optimism about human nature. Full restitution for any financial losses I suffered. A public apology acknowledging your mistakes. And 5 years of demonstrated change, proving that you've learned to put family loyalty above everything else. 5 years. Your father believed that real change takes time, I said. If you can show that you've truly learned to honor and protect your family, if you can prove that you'll never again allow anyone to abuse someone you love, then yes, the trust funds will be restored. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his father's ring, Uncle Michael's ring, hanging around his neck like an anchor. What about the house? He asked finally. And Melissa? And everything? The house is mine, I said simply. It always has been. Your wife is going to prison for multiple felonies. And everything else depends on the choices you make from this moment forward. I don't know how to make this right. You start, I said, reaching over to lift the chain from around his neck, by giving Uncle Michael's ring back to Aunt Sarah, where it belongs. He didn't resist as I took the ring, his father's brother's final gift to his own wife, stolen through greed and returned through grace. And then, he asked. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Harold's roses were beginning their final bloom of the season. Then you decide who you want to be, David. The man your father raised you to become, or the man Melissa turned you into. What if I choose wrong again? Then you'll lose everything that really matters, I said honestly. But if you choose correctly, if you spend the next 5 years proving that family means more to you than money, that love is worth more than property, that protecting the people you care about matters more than personal convenience. Then you'll discover that your father left you something much more valuable than money. I turned back to face him, this son I still loved despite everything. He left you the chance to become a man worthy of the Thompson name. Outside, the police car was pulling away, taking Melissa toward a future she'd never imagined when she'd started planning to steal my life. Inside, David sat surrounded by documents that proved his poor mother was worth more money than he'd ever dreamed of, and his future depended entirely on whether he could remember the values his father had tried to teach him. I want to try, he said finally. I want to be the man Dad thought I could be. Then we'll start with Uncle Michael's ring, I said, walking toward the phone. Sarah's been heartbroken since the funeral, thinking it was lost forever. As I dialed the number, I could see Harold's roses swaying in the afternoon breeze, their petals beginning to fall like confetti celebrating the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Some gifts, I'd learned, had to be earned. Some lessons could only be taught through loss. And sometimes, love meant letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when it broke your heart to watch. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, if you'd raised your children with the right values buried deep enough to survive even the worst influences, sometimes people found their way back to who they were meant to be. 5 years would tell us which kind of story this was going to be. In the meantime, I had a phone call to make, a ring to return, and a life to rebuild on my own terms. For the first time in 3 years, I was looking forward to tomorrow.